Collins, Colorado. I'm your host and moderator for today's webinar. And I guess first I want to begin by letting everyone know that we're recording this webinar, and RAP will be posting both the recording and the slide deck to our website as soon as we can. And as you can see, the topic for today is tariff design. We're going to hear from two of the authors of RAP's recent publication, Designing Distributed Generation Tariffs Well. That publication is available for free from RAP's website, or if you see one of us at an upcoming meeting or conference, we can probably get you a hard copy. But let me start with a brief explanation of how we'll conduct this webinar. We expect a huge audience today, and I'm very pleased with that, but it means the only way we can control the audio quality is to mute everyone's lines. So you'll not have the chance to speak today, but you can participate. The way to participate is to type any questions you might have into the chat box, which should be on the control panel, towards the bottom of the control panel for your webinar window. And just type your questions into that box and we will see them. We'll be monitoring those questions closely, and if I see a question that really needs to be answered immediately, I'm going to interrupt our presenter. Otherwise, I'm going to hold questions until after the presentations are done. And then I'll direct as many of them as possible to our presenters in the time we have available. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you afterwards. I also want to let everyone know that we have a backup plan if by any chance our webinar platform should fail. So if the system goes down, please check your email inbox immediately for an announcement from us about how to proceed. And I think that about covers the logistics. All that remains is for me to introduce today's speakers. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Carl Linvill, who joins us from his home base in Davis, California. Carl is one of the principals at RAP, and he's been with us since February of 2013. Carl previously served as a Public Utilities Commissioner in Nevada from 2003 to 2006, and as Economic and Energy Advisor to former Nevada Governor Kenny Glynn for 2 years prior to that. As an advisor to Governor Glynn and as a utility commissioner, Dr. Linvill represented the governor in the negotiation of Nevada's Renewable Portfolio Standard Law. He drafted Nevada's first statewide electricity plan in 2002 and amended Nevada's Integrated Resource Planning regulations in 2004. Carl also evaluated energy efficiency and renewable energy plans as the utilities work towards compliance with the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Carl has experience as a rates analyst for a large utility, as an economics professor, and as utility commission staff economist. Dr. Linvill received his BA in mathematics and economics from the University of California at Davis, and his PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The second speaker you'll hear from is Jim Lazar. Jim will be presenting from his office in Olympia, Washington. Jim Lazar has maintained a consulting practice in electric and natural gas utility rate making and resource planning since 1982. His clients have included municipal and cooperative utilities, natural gas utilities, regulatory commissions, consumer advocates, and public interest organizations in the U.S., Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. Jim has been a principal author of handbooks and articles on consumer participation in electric utility planning, integrated resource planning, and incentive regulation. He's assisted RAP since 1998 and worked on projects with us in the United States, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Israel, the Philippines, Mauritius, and so on. Jim Lazar holds a BA in economics from Western Washington University. And with those introductions, I'm pleased to hand the presentation off to Dr. Carl Linvill. Take it away, Carl.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to be with you today. Jim, if you could go ahead and advance the slide. Today we're going to first provide some context on the paper that we've prepared. Second, we're going to talk about the 12 sort of takeaways. Third, we're going to walk through some rate design examples and lessons. If you've heard this paper presented before, kind of the different thing about this presentation is we're going to spend a lot more time on the rate design examples and lessons. Then we'll conclude, have some questions in the manner that John described earlier. Next slide, please.
Carl, your audio is a little weak.
Okay. Is this better? Is this better?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. We started out this project because of all the discussion going on around the country, and this is a national audience today, so the observations we're going to be giving, of course, have somewhat different implications in different places depending on where you are. But we started this work, a couple observations. One is that there's a lot of discussion around distributed generation tariffs, net energy metering, feed-in tariffs, value of solar tariffs. There's beginning to be some concern about rate design issues associated with those tariffs or in addition to those tariffs. And so we started thinking that, maybe there's something we could contribute to helping people have some perspective on how the situation in their state might be similar or different than other places. It's our view that we're in a transition toward an economy where the customer resource, whether it's energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation storage, is going to play a much more active role. Different places in the country are in different places in that transition, but it's important to think about the fact that as we think about implementing tariffs today, that we're looking toward the implications of how the tariffs we implement today could potentially facilitate or deter that transition. The forces behind the transition have been talked about a lot, and I'm not going to go into them. But there's no doubt that power sector institutions are evolving, and there's a concern both to be positioning the power sector to take advantage of customer resources in a full way, and also to ensure fair compensation for everyone in this time of transition. Fair compensation for utilities, for grid services, fair compensation to those who have invested in distributed generation systems and provide value to their systems, a fair deal for customers that are not participants, have not invested in distributed generation. So that's what we want to look at today. What can we say about distribution tariffs and providing fair compensation? Next slide, please. Another overarching theme in this is that we believe that sound decision-making now is going to benefit everyone. It's going to benefit consumers, utilities, investors, employees, the regulatory process, and society as a whole. The short-term policies that simply shift risk rather than managing the risk well is going to be inherently unstable. So another concern that we have as we think about tariffs is, are these tariffs that we're implementing now in this transition period, are they sustainable? Next slide, please. So the first 4 points that we make in our paper is that value is a two or more way street, meaning that the customer who invests in a distributed generation system is providing value to the system. The utility that is managing the infrastructure of the grid is providing value to that customer as well as to all customers. There are also intermediaries in that deal that may also be adding value by their participation, aggregators and so forth. So it's important to recognize that we're moving into this period where value is a two or more way street. Second, we find that in different places in the country, as they think about distributed generation, sometimes they do not include all of the relevant sources of cost and benefit. and that they sometimes do not consider those costs and benefits over the long term. An investment in a distributed generation system is a long-term investment on the part of the customer, and it provides long-term benefits to the system. So therefore, it should be considered from perspective of long-term benefits and costs. Of course, different places are going to interpret those benefits and costs and include them in different ways, depending on the policies of those states and the regulatory precedents in those states and so forth. And that leads us to the third point, that evaluation method really needs to be considered on a state-by-state basis. RAP has opinions about what good valuation looks like in a generic sense, but we recognize also that states come from very different places. And we encourage states to, and public utility commissions, public service commissions, to intentionally consider valuation methods and select a valuation method and consistently apply that method. Our fourth takeaway point that we think all states should think about is that cross-subsidies may flow either way. In the news, we most commonly hear of cross-subsidies flowing from non-participating customers to participating customers. Next slide, please. This, in fact, depends. If the value of PV, if the distributed generation is PV, the value of that PV is less than the compensation then they're receiving, then other customers are subsidizing PV customers and so forth. However, it's also possible that the value of PV, it could be greater than compensation, in which case PV customers are in fact subsidizing other customers. So entering into a study of the situation in your state, one should be agnostic regarding how that subsidy might run until you choose a valuation method, apply it, and see how things turn out for your situation. Next slide. The next 4 points are listed on this page. We see a lot around the country of drawing from examples from extreme situations. I'll show you a slide on that in just a minute. So I'm going to hold off on that for just a second and talk about the other ones, and I'll talk about that one again. There isn't, as I talked about, that we're in a transition towards this more transactive energy economy where customers play a more significant role in providing resources to the system. That plays into the fact that in some places, customer resources, distributed generation resources, are an infant industry. And if one believes that that industry is going to become an integral part of their electric system going forward, there is a tradition for there being some period of subsidization. So subsidization may or may not be a problem depending on where your industry is and what your policy is towards the transition. Other rules matter, like interconnection. We're not going to talk about that a lot today, but all the policies where there's interface between the utility's electric system and the distributed generator is important. We just are not dealing with that directly today. It's a good principle in regulation to keep things as simple as possible, to make things no more complicated than necessary, and this is also true in the case of designing distributed generation tariffs well. Next slide, please. So now moving back to the extrapolating from extreme situations, we often see California, and Southern California in particular, but California as a whole, pulled out as an example of there's a big cross-subsidy issue. Well, California has a really different rate design, a very high tail block rate, which feeds into that high cross-subsidization finding. So as we look at different places, of course, people disagree about the magnitude of that cross-subsidization, or if there even is one in California, but certainly it's true to say that the situation in California is far different than most other states. And so simply taking findings from some of these extreme situations and assuming that it applies to your situation without going through work of deciding on a valuation methodology and making a determination is really a mistake. Next slide. So the final 4 points that we raise in the paper, we encourage, as we've been talking about, we do believe there's this transition towards a transactive energy economy where customer resources are going to play a more active role. And we support regulators and utilities and third parties, customers, to get together to think about innovative power sector models that work well in supporting this transition. The 10th point, incentive decisions are made. Sometimes it's decided that there's going to be an incentive offered to people, maybe for an infant industry reason, for adopting solar. That decision is a policy decision. Perhaps it's a wise decision in some situations and so forth, but it's really a separate decision from designing the tariffs well, choosing a tariff and designing it well. It's an interrelated decision, but they should be arrived at, as separate decisions. Likewise with decoupling. Decoupling is an important mechanism that RAP talks a lot about, but that's really something that should be decided in parallel to deciding on these rate design and distributed generation tariff issues. And then finally, we think it's very important to consider mechanisms for have-nots, for customers that have lower income, that perhaps cannot afford to participate in some of these distributed generation programs. Is there a way for making this distributed generation tariff work well for have-nots? Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim now to talk about tariffs and rate design. Jim.
All right. Well, thanks, Carl, for that. Rate design matters. And in one of our papers that was published about a year ago on rate design for systems that do not have fully deployed advanced metering infrastructure, we did an analysis of how much change in usage we would expect from a change in rate design based upon a pretty modest elasticity factor of minus 0.2, which is at the low end of what most analyses show as the long-run price elasticity for electricity. We started with a flat rate and considered an inclining block rate and a straight fixed variable rate with a very large fixed charge. The inclining block rate we estimated would result in about 7% less usage than the flat rate. And the straight fixed variable rate, collecting all the distribution costs in a monthly fixed charge, we estimated would result in about 8% more consumption than the flat rate. And while these particular rates are probably not illustrative of your utility, they're an indication that the difference between good rate design and bad rate design, between progressive rate design and rate design that does not emphasize the usage charge, can make a big difference in total consumption. And so one of the things that we will be talking about, we talk about in the paper and we'll talk about today, is being aware of how a change in rate design will affect change in usage. A 15% swing in usage is like a decade of energy efficiency program work. So with that as a background, there's a number of concerns for residential distributed generation customers. Cost recovery for the utility costs, compensation for the DG provider, and concerns, as Carl mentioned, about haves, people that can afford to install DG systems and have-nots. And the poster child for this is my late friend Sam, who has a Nissan Leaf, a Chevy Volt, and enough solar on the roof of his house to net meter to zero every month. Sometimes Sam is taking 20 kW from the grid. Sometimes he's feeding 12 kW to the grid, but he's set things up so that his annual electricity bill is zero under net metering. A lot of people would be concerned that he's using the grid and not compensating the grid for that use. Others, he's on a particularly low-cost utility, would argue that he's feeding a high-quality, high-value resource to the utility and subsidizing the grid. But he's certainly the poster child for this. So we considered a lot of alternative and supplemental tariff policies in the paper. And I've highlighted a few of these that I'm going to talk about today. They're all addressed in the paper. So one is the residential rate design, 3 different approaches of collecting distribution costs in a fixed charge, through a demand charge, or through a bi-directional distribution rate. We look at time varying rates pretty much as the foundation of our analysis. We think that's where the industry will eventually go. A decade ago, the cost of metering for time varying rates was high. It no longer is. And finally, I'll look at the value of solar tariff. We've seen this implemented in Austin and adopted as a concept in Minnesota, and the foundation of a decision in Arizona. It's an important concept to look at. So we're going to start with a diagram of a distribution system and target different pieces of it, starting with what really belongs in the fixed charge. The only distribution costs that are truly attributable to any particular customer are the meter, maybe the service drop, and the billing and collection costs. And I've circled here that that's just the part that's immediately at the customer premises. A fixed charge that covers more than this diverges from pretty long-held regulatory tradition. I think, virtually every state utility regulator has considered, back in the 1978 to 80 period when they were required to consider and determine rate-making principles, considered and decided that the distribution infrastructure costs did not belong in the category of customer-related costs. Now the transformer does have to be sized to the combined load of just a few customers. And so there's a reason to look at the transformer a little bit differently from the rest of the distribution circuit costs. But the rest of the distribution circuit is sized to the combined load of many customers and probably does not belong in the fixed charge. And at the end, I'll talk about how this decision affects different kinds of customers. The poles and wires, the substations, the distribution circuits costs, overhead and underground, is sized to meet the combined loads of all customers. Adding or losing a customer doesn't change those costs. If I divide my house into a duplex, the distribution circuit design doesn't change unless the duplex has more usage, more demand than the single home did. Similarly, if a house burns down and isn't replaced, the distribution circuit costs don't change. Now those circuits are built to deliver electricity, to deliver kilowatt hours. That's what customers want. While they're sized to a peak demand, that's not the reason they're built. They're built to deliver energy. And so in doing cost studies, we often look at the cause for costs being incurred, not just the design attributes of them. And so all customers that use them, arguably, for moving electricity ought to share in the costs. Now, we've looked at a couple of different ways that are appropriate for recovering these circuit costs. And what we've come up with is either a bi-directional kilowatt hour charge, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent slide, or a per kW demand charge. For commercial and industrial customers, these folks over here, typically their rate design does include a demand charge per kW. We've not done that for residential customers for 2 different reasons. One, in the past it was much more expensive to meter for demand, and we saved money on meters. But also, individual houses have usage patterns that vary during the day. And if I use power at if I get up at 8 in the morning and this neighbor gets up at 7 in the morning and someone else gets up at 5 in the morning, our coffee pots and microwaves and hair dryers are running at slightly different hours. There's a lot of what we call diversity in demand between residential customers. And it's important to recognize that the individual customer's demand is not really a particularly good indicator of the amount of usage they make of the overall distribution grid. And so we've kept the distribution cost recovery mostly as a kilowatt-hour charge in most rate design in most parts of the U.S. Now, the bulk power costs are a different matter altogether. Those are capacity requirements that are driven by peak demand for peaking units. There are base load resources that are built for providing energy all of the time. Most transmission investment is associated with base load generating plant, bringing power from coal and nuclear plants to the cities. Some of it is now associated with renewable generating facilities, primarily wind, also bringing energy rather than peaking capacity to the customers. So it's a mix of demand-related and energy-related costs, and from our perspective, a time-of-use energy charge is probably the best way to follow cost causation for this. So with that background, this is a table from the paper that looks at alternative rate designs for net metering. We're starting in this case with a residential tariff that's a flat rate, $5 a month fixed charge to cover billing and collection costs, and a 14.5-cent energy rate. And for our customer that's using 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, half of it on peak, half of it off peak, that customer pays $150 a month. So we designed 3 alternative rate designs that would recover the same revenue from the same usage pattern. The first was a fixed charge of $35 a month and a time of use rate, so recovering substantially all of the distribution costs in a monthly charge. The second was a demand charge with a $3 per kilowatt per month demand charge and the same time of use rate. And the third was a bi-directional distribution charge, again keeping the billing and collection charge at $5 a month. But this is the one that's probably a little unusual, you may not have seen before, a 3-cent per kilowatt hour distribution charge that applies in both directions, whether power is coming from the grid or going to the grid. And when we multiply these times the customer's usage patterns, the demand charge produces $30 a month, 10 kW of demand times $3 kW demand charge, total of 150. In the case of the bidirectional charge, half of the energy, 500 kilowatt hours, comes from the grid, 500 is fed to the grid, so this customer is using the grid to move 1,000 kilowatt hours, and times 3 cents produces $30 in distribution costs, charges, and a total of 150. So now let's zero in on these rates a little closer. The first is a fixed variable rate design, where all distribution costs are recovered in a monthly fixed charge regardless of usage. So this has a monthly fixed charge of $35 that covers the billing and collection costs and the distribution system costs. Only the energy charge would be subject to net metering. This customer would get 8 cents a kilowatt hour for power fed to the grid off-peak and 15 cents for power fed to the grid during on-peak periods. The second is a residential demand charge. It's very similar to typical commercial rates, with the demand charge based on the highest demand for the month. But the residential demand charge will be a much lower demand charge than for commercial if it is properly designed, because of the great deal of diversity that exists. While commercial customers have much more uniform usage patterns, residential customers wake up at different times of the day and use their appliances at different times of the day. So the diversity factor results in, instead of a $10 demand charge you might see in commercial tariff, only about a $3 demand charge is necessary to recover the same kinds of costs from residential customers. And again, there's a on-peak and off-peak energy rate that is subject to the net metering rate. The third example is the one that's a little unusual, a bidirectional rate concept. When the PV customer is getting power from the grid operator is compensated. When they're delivering power to the grid operator is compensated. I'll say that again. When the PV customer is sending power to the grid, they pay the grid operator for distribution services in order to take their surplus electricity and go find a customer for it. Power flows in both directions at the same time of use values. The customer pays the same rate that they receive for their power. There's no discrimination between the valuation of the customer's electricity or the utility's electricity. One thing about this type of rate design, it does require bidirectional metering. Not even all smart meter systems are capable of this. So if you're moving to a smart metering system, you may want to consider meters that have the ability to measure bidirectional flows. So now we're going to break down the bills for these alternative rate designs and see what the customer, the net metering customer, who produces as much power as they consume. Here we've assumed a 10 kW maximum demand, 1,000 kilowatt hours of total consumption, half on peak, half off peak, 1,000 kilowatt hours produced on site, 500 kilowatt hours of that used on site, 500 kilowatt hours imported from the grid during the off-peak hours, 500 exported to the grid during the on-peak hours. This is not exactly what we would expect to see, but it's a good approximation. For the typical tariff, the customer would pay the fixed charge. They would pay $72.50 for the off-peak energy they get from the grid and receive $72.50 for the on-peak energy they deliver back to the grid. They'd wind up with a total bill of $5. For the fixed charge rate design, the customer, now we're going to a time of use rate, remember. The customer will pay $40 for the power they get from the grid. They'll get $75 for the power they deliver to the grid. Their net bill will be $0, but they're paying $35 in distribution service costs, but they're making $35 on the power supply. In the second option, the demand charge, the customer is $5 billing and collection fee, $30 demand charge. Once again, they're buying power off-peak for $40, selling power on-peak for $75, and their total bill is $0. But they are also paying $35 a month for distribution costs. And finally, the bidirectional customer with the bidirectional distribution rate, $5 fixed charge for billing and collection, 1,000 kilowatt hours moving one direction or another through the distribution system times 3 cents is $30. Buying power off-peak for $40, selling power on-peak for $75. Their total bill is $0, but they also are paying $35 a month for distribution service. In all three of these examples, the solar customer is benefiting from the fact that the power they produce and deliver to the grid comes at a more valuable time than the power that they receive from the grid. They're all paying the same distribution costs. But there's an important thing to pay attention to, and that is that while all of those produce the same bill for the average customer at 1,000 kilowatt hours, what happens to the small use customer? All of these examples produce a $150 bill at 1,000 kilowatt hours under the assumptions I've used. But for the customer with a 500 kilowatt hour bill, they pay $77.50 under any of the volumetric rate designs, the current rate design, the demand charge rate design, the bi-directional rate design, but $92.50 under the high fixed charge because they're paying as much for distribution service as a larger customer, even though they're not using as much distribution service. And it is, frankly, the small use customers, the apartment dwellers, are the least likely to be able to or to invest in distributed generation. They are most likely to be the have-nots. First of all, as apartment dwellers, they don't have control over their roof. They may not have enough roof to handle solar for their whole building. And if they're renters, they don't have the time horizon or the access to capital that a homeowner does. They're not as able to lease a solar system as a homeowner is. So these small users are most likely to be the have-nots, and concern about them makes using the high fixed charge approach the least attractive of the options for recovering distribution costs. Now I'm going to turn to the value.
Shenot, could I interrupt you briefly?
Sure.
On your last two slides, could you clarify the difference between the total bill and the total distribution?
Sure.
The bottom two lines there.
Well, the PV customer's total bill is the sum of their payments for the fixed charge, the energy charge, the demand charge, the distribution charge, minus what they get back from net metering, from selling power back to the utility. And I went through the examples in this slide. The total bill calculates out to zero under our three scenarios for that customer. But within that rate design, they're making money on power. They're buying cheap off-peak power and selling more valuable on-peak power back to the utility, and that offsets the distribution costs. So their total bill comes to zero. But that total bill is $35 for distribution costs and a negative $35 for electricity costs. So that's the total bill part of it. The distribution part of it is what they're paying to the utility for the fixed charge, demand charge, and distribution charge in each of these three example rate designs. Does that get it, John?
Okay, thank you.
Now I'm going to turn to a value of solar tariff. VOST, it's now being called, is a form of a feed-in tariff. The term feed-in tariff simply means a price that is set for the receipt of renewable generated electricity that is available to any customer to feed energy to the utility. In some places they're 3 cents, and in some places they're 30 cents. A value of solar tariff is one that is calculated based on what is the value that solar energy brings to the utility system and its customers and its community. The customer receives the value for the energy capacity and other services that they provide, and the customer separately can buy all of their power requirements at the normal retail rate. This has been implemented in Austin, Texas. It has been adopted by the Minnesota Commission as an alternative available to utilities, an alternative to feed-in to net metering tariffs, and is certainly under consideration in a number of other places right now. So here I've got a graphic that shows all of the kinds of values that one might look at. First, utility system values: fuel, generation capacity, transmission, distribution, line losses, reserves, ancillary services, environmental benefits, and benefits in the form of local jobs. The distributed generation advocate would look at this entire stack and say, my solar power is worth 18 cents a kilowatt hour. A narrow utility view might look at this stack and say, in the short run, all I'm avoiding is the fuel for my generating plants, and it's worth more like 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And indeed, we've seen value of solar studies that reach values that include few or all of these. This is a Rocky Mountain Institute survey of multiple value of solar studies, ranging from some that were, under a nickel a kilowatt hour, mostly looking at short-run costs only to the utility system, some up in the 30 cent per kilowatt hour range, looking at long-run costs in some cases, including societal, environmental, and local economic development benefits. It's these methodologies are not the same. We would not expect them to produce the same results. The simple average of these is about 17 cents a kilowatt hour. The average U.S. residential rate currently is about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And if this simple average were to be a meaningful and representative number, what it tells us is that for the average utility, adding solar to their system is bringing more value than the retail rate, and the solar customer is subsidizing the society, the grid, the community. These are all different measures, and just to put it in perspective, the current estimate that's come from Austin is about a dime. The current estimate from Minnesota is about 13 cents. So hovering around the average residential rate. A value solar tariff is a buy-sell arrangement. That is, the utility buys all of the solar output, typically at a levelized price, and a levelized price that reflects a new renewable resource. As the utility is receiving a renewable resource, it's getting a premium product. And the customer pays the normal residential tariff, which likely includes a mix of older, cheaper resources, quite possibly some older, dirtier fossil resources that happen to be cheap on the utility's revenue requirement, but may not be cheap in a societal sense. But that residential tariff is likely to rise over time. And so the value solar tariff will fix the price for the life of the solar system at a levelized price, and that's very typically the kinds of contracts that utilities enter into with large solar and other renewable wind power producers, a long-term contract at a fixed price. Net metering at the retail rate, on the other hand, would give the customer less value in the early years, but as the retail rate goes up, net metering may provide more value in the long run. So the customer looking at just today's price might actually prefer the value of solar price because it's giving them more money in the short run. But 10 or 12 years from now, when those lines cross over, that customer might say, oh, gee, I goofed. I should have taken the net metering, pursued a net metering rate. It's important for regulators, utilities, consumers, and solar installers who are facing a choice of alternatives to bear in mind that one of them is likely to remain stable and the other is likely to change over time. Some of the value of solar tariff proposals have let it be dynamic, and Austin has actually done this. They changed the price they're paying unilaterally, and that's an approach that one needs to have a little bit of caution about. If the utility can unilaterally or the regulator can unilaterally change the price you're receiving, then it's impossible to make a rational business decision to invest in the system and commit to a long-term contract. Large power producers always are very careful in their contracts to make sure that their needs are being met over the term of the contract. So I have a little bit of concern about how Austin has unilaterally changed its value of solar tariff. It's a feature that needs to be designed into a VOST. So that ends my presentation on the details, and I'm going to hand it back to Carl to kind of wrap this up.
So today I'm just going to, we talked about the importance of choosing a valuation methodology, aligning it with interpretation of public interest in your state. We've made the point that the grid is important to all customers, and these costs should be fairly recovered from all customers, that the DG customer provides value to all customers, and that value should be compensated fairly. We've also made the point, and I'm going to make it a little more explicitly now, that net energy metering, feed-in tariff, and value of solar feed-in tariffs can each be designed well and provide fair compensation for all. One of the discussions that was going on at the beginning time when we wrote this paper was, you know, should we choose one over the other? Is there one that's fair and one that's not fair? Fairness really depends upon implementation. Each of these tariffs, if you choose your valuation methodology well, if you interpret those costs and benefits well, you can design the terms of your net energy metering tariff to be fair to all. You can design a feed-in tariff that will be fair to all. You can design a value of solar tariff that will be fair to all. So likely there'll be other considerations that come into your deliberation on weighing whether you want to do one, the other, or some combination of both. Next slide, please. It shouldn't be surprising that the value of solar can be less than or greater than the price. There's just a little statement of why there. We tried to make the point here, Jim did an excellent job making the point that rate design can address the fair compensation issue as it relates to small users. And again, we want to emphasize that administrative simplicity matters. So John, ready to hand it back to you, and we're ready for questions.
Great, thank you, Carl. I'm going to apologize in advance for two things to everybody. First of all, we have got a ton of questions that have come in, and there's no way we're going to get to all of them today. But as I said before, we will get back to you offline for any questions we can't address today. That's the first apology, as it were. And the second one is that I'm going to suggest that those who can stay an extra 5 or 10 minutes at the most, so that we have a little more time to answer more of these questions. Even with that extra 10 minutes, we won't get through all of them. But I think it would be time well spent for those of you who don't have to immediately go on to your next thing. So we're going to go until 10 minutes after the hour. And I'm going to do my best to pick questions that address a variety of issues that have come up. And I will start with one for Jim that is more on the order of clarification. Jim, are you aware of any utility that has implemented a bidirectional distribution rate?
Not yet.
You suggested here. Not yet. Okay. And here's another question. I'll stick with the theme of the bidirectional distribution charge model. One person has asked, could you get to the same result as that bidirectional distribution charge simply by reducing compensation for exported energy by the same amount, the same 3 cents in your example?
Yes, I think so. But you still have to be able to measure the bidirectional flows.
Okay. Let me ask, this question is probably more for Carl. How would you respond to the argument that ratepayers on their bills should not pay societal benefits? You've discussed some societal benefits in a couple of your slides.
Yeah, so the decision on including societal benefits is a policy decision. one that regulators have to make in light of the policy and statutes in their state. So if their state supports their ability to include those costs, then we think it's entirely legitimate for them to. But again, some states that's not really within the scope of what regulators feel that they have the flexibility to do, and in those cases, you'll find that they aren't interested in considering any of those external costs other than the ones that are directly quantified by through taxes on externalities and so forth.
Jim, when you talked about the possible swing in consumption, the elasticity based on rate design, you talked about a possible 15% swing in consumption. If most or all of that variation or that increment is coming from renewable resources, is there really a concern?
I suppose if those renewable resources are expensive, and encouraging customers to use them at a below-cost rate is certainly not a desirable result. If all of the kilowatt hours on the system were from qualifying renewable resources, meaning low environmental impact renewable resources, there wouldn't be an environmental concern. But if the end block rate, if the incremental price is less than the long-run incremental cost of a renewable resource plus the transmission, distribution, and other costs, line losses, reserves to get it to the customer, one would be encouraging inefficient consumption. And since rates are normally set to recover average costs, while the incremental cost of a renewable resource delivered to the customer may be much higher, you wind up with inefficient use of resources, even if it is all renewable.
Okay, thank you. Here's another, I think more of a clarification question. You have a stacked bar chart, Jim, for the value of solar tariff. And we have a question, wouldn't there be a negative value somewhere on that chart that represents the utility's increased costs?
If the utility has increased cost, for example, to install voltage regulators at certain points on the system in order to integrate the resource, yes, that cost should be shown somewhere as a negative value.
Okay. And apologies to Carl, a lot of the questions go for Jim's part of the presentation, but Jim, another clarification on the bi-directional charge concept. Would the bi-directional charge also apply to self-consumption, the on-site consumption?
No. No, I mean, if you don't go to the grocery store and you don't buy groceries, you don't pay any part of the grocery store's fixed or variable operating costs. If you grow your own tomatoes, you eat your own tomatoes, and the grocery store has to recover its costs from people who are buying tomatoes at the grocery store or from you when you're buying other products at the grocery store. Okay. And so the answer is no.
Okay, so if the customer was never exporting, then they would just be paying the charge for the energy they purchase off the grid. Okay.
Correct.
And here's maybe a somewhat more complicated question, but I've heard the argument, and one of our questioners poses the point that when the customer that has a PV system is exporting to the grid, that in fact, in virtually all cases, that excess production is consumed essentially by one of their neighbors, and that the neighbor pays a retail rate, which includes use of those same distribution wires, the distribution system. So what would you make of the claim, of the utility claims that PV customers are not paying for that aspect of their grid use? Or is there the potential for double paying of it?
Clearly, when a customer is exporting, the power is going to the nearest load that needs it. And we're now finding in Hawaii that a fair number of the circuits are now running backwards. That is, that the power is having to go all the way, is in essence going back to the substation and having to find a load on another circuit. So as saturation gets higher, that power has to actually flow farther than just to your next door neighbor. And with high saturation of variable renewables, that'll become more likely to occur in other places. Yes, the neighbor is paying a distribution charge, and if in fact this approach were implemented, the utilities' distribution billing determinants would increase, and the price would eventually drop, in case of this example, to less than 3 cents. In that situation, then the DG owner would pay a little less than 3 cents. The person receiving the kilowatt hour would pay a little less than 3 cents, and the non-participant, the non-owner, would also pay a little less than 3 cents for the power that they're receiving. And so they would, the have-nots, the non-participants, would actually be made a little bit better off, consistent with the principle that if a project is good societally, it ought to be possible for everyone to be better off. And by charging both the producer and the consumer a distribution charge, you both recover the cost of the distribution system from all who use it, and you also provide a net economic benefit to everybody on the system. I'm not going to pretend that this is not a difficult concept to understand, or nor that it would be a difficult one to implement. But it's a concept that we've shared that a lot of technical analysts and economic analysts have said that it really needs to be on the table.
Okay, thanks. As I said, we're going to go until 10 minutes after the hour and try to get through more of these questions. The next one that I want that I'm hoping you can field is, could you explain, or have you given some thought about how these different rate designs would work in an RTO environment where costs are based on locational marginal prices?
Well, the locational marginal prices are, I'm going to just come to the demand charge rate design for this one. The locational marginal prices are going to produce the on-peak, off-peak energy rates for the combination of production and transmission costs. And in that situation, the local distribution utility is going to be responsible for billing and recovering their distribution costs, regardless of whether the customer chooses a bundled service or a third-party power supplier. And so I think the rate design concepts, because it is an unbundled rate design concept, I'm now going to back up to the map of one price for bulk power here would be the RTO locational marginal price, getting down to somewhere in the the sub-transmission level to the service territory, and a distribution price that is set by the regulator and applied by the local distribution utility, and a customer charge that's for the customer-specific costs. So I think it works fine in an RTO framework. And in fact, it's sort of copied from the RTO framework.
Okay, next question. So, Jim, you also talked a little bit about impacts of different rate designs on low-income customers. Actually, small-use customers would also include highly efficient customers. And the question is, don't high fixed charges deter or lessen the benefits of energy efficiency in addition to whatever impacts they have on low-income customers?
Yes, and that was sort of where we started, and I'll refer people to our paper on rate design where advanced metering infrastructure has not been fully deployed, rather than this paper that we're discussing today for a detailed discussion of that. This straight fixed variable rate that I took from that paper of $30 a month at 6 cents a kilowatt hour greatly diminishes the savings that the highly efficient customer would achieve, as compared to the inclining block rate design that is sort of the standard on the West Coast and the Northeast and the Northern Tier states, but is not common in the middle of the country. The inclining block rate is going to give that highly efficient customer 10 to 14 cents for each kilowatt hour savings for each kilowatt hour they conserve, as opposed to the straight fixed variable rate is they're only going to save 6 cents. And that's definitely another reason that the straight fixed variable rate design is maybe the least desirable choice for how to recover distribution costs. The demand charge rate will, if the demand charge is measured on at least an hourly basis, that is no shorter period than an hour, will generally track the volumetric usage for a non-PV customer, but will fully capture the maximum demand that the PV customer puts on the grid whenever it occurs. And a more sophisticated approach to this would be to have a demand charge that was $1 a kilowatt off-peak and more than $3 a kilowatt on-peak, so that it was time differentiated. That's probably a little more complicated rate design than residential customers are ready for.
Okay. Well, on that issue of complication, did you consider, does our paper consider any tariffs that are closer to a real-time structure? And if not, could you comment on what impact a real-time pricing kind of rate might have?
Frankly, a real-time pricing rate is going to have lower prices off-peak and higher prices on-peak. So it's going to ultimately be manifest in a similar rate design to what we've shown here with fixed time of use prices, except the customer will be exposed to more uncertainty, and the utility will have greater certainty of recovering their costs. It's a risk shift, not really a significant change in the design. Illinois has, I think, is a state that has experimented with dynamic pricing for residential customers, and I haven't reviewed the evaluations of those to have an opinion as to whether it's been acceptable or not.
All right. I've still got dozens of questions on my screen, and I think I only have time for one or two more. Again, if we don't answer your question on the webinar, we will get back to them out separately, offline. But I do want to respect people's times and wrap this up in a couple of minutes. So one different type of question than any we've fielded so far is has to do with renewable energy credits. Most of these distributed generation systems are renewable, and can you discuss how RECs might be dealt with under different tariff designs, net metering, value of solar, different designs you've discussed, Jim?
Well, the RECs are one possible layer in the value of solar calculation. Some utilities require customers to turn the RECs over to the utility as part of the quid pro quo for the utility providing assistance or incentive payments for the installation of the systems. Others do not. I think that's it should be a conscious state-by-state determination of who gets the RECs and how are they valued. And I know one of the reasons that the buy-sell arrangement is attractive to utilities in California is because they can only count the resource as meeting the renewable portfolio standard if they actually acquire the kilowatt hours, so that just a net metering framework doesn't give them that benefit. Some of those utilities have required RECs to be transferred to the utility, but in California, RECs are not as valuable as a system integrated renewable resource possessed by the utility. It's part of the value stream, and it needs to be a part of the negotiation of the form of tariff.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. Folks, I think it'd probably take us another hour to get through all these questions, and we're not going to do that. I think I'm going to cut it off there. If your question wasn't answered, we will try to get back to you offline, and we'll continue the conversation in other ways. One of the things I hope everyone walks away with is that utilities and regulators do have lots of options for tariff design, and that we at RAP believe it's possible to design tariffs that are fair to everyone, to the utilities, the customers with distributed generation, and the customers that don't have distributed generation. And in fact, we think it's essential to find those solutions, solutions that promote distributed generation, but at the same time protect all consumers and send the right price signals about conserving energy, and absolutely tariffs that compensate utilities fairly for the grid services that they provide and that are so essential to our economic health. Before signing off, I want to once again encourage everyone to read RAP's publication, Designing Distributed Generation Tariffs Well, and thank you all for attending the webinar. I hope the rest of your day is terrific, and that's it. Goodbye for now.